So I have a new project made with IntelliJ. This is a Java project, and I'm using Gradle to build this. So we'll be adding a couple of dependencies here for the ActiveMQ connectors. And it's only going to be two dependencies. There's the javax.jms, that's the Java messaging system. And then another one for the ActiveMQ. This is the org.apache.activemq dependencies. If I sync this, then it's going to maybe download some dependencies to your M2 folder. But now we can get started on creating our producer. So based on some work I've done already with these things, it's easiest to make it into a static class, which can then be called from anywhere. Because I used this in a Spring Boot app, and there it was a bit annoying with making it an auto-wired dependency. So I'm just going to implement it as a static class, and then we can just call place message from wherever. I'm going to make a new package here. I'm going to call it my messaging package, and then in there I'll make a producer. But good practice is to name this producer the same as the item that is going to be dealing with. So we can say that we want to be dealing with items in this case. So I'll make an item producer. And we could have this thing implement auto closable, because we're going to be opening up some ActiveMQ resources that we'll need to close when this class gets reallocated. So I'm going to override this close, get rid of the throws exception part here, because we'll just catch them in here and do nothing with them. So in order to produce messages to an ActiveMQ queue, we'll need a couple of things. The first thing is going to be a base URL for the ActiveMQ broker. Then we'll need some ActiveMQ connections, and those are built with a factory. So we'll have a private connection factory, and this is going to require an import from JavaX JMS. And then I'll just call this connection factory. Then the connection factory is going to give us a connection. So this I'll just call connection. After that, we'll need an ActiveMQ session. And from the session, we can finally build destinations. And in our case, that's going to be a queue. So we're producing stuff in this class. So I'm going to have a private message producer. Call it producer. And then just for some diagnostics later on, I'd like to be able to see if this class is in error. So I'll have a Boolean for in error and a string that holds the actual error message. So that's looking pretty good. But because I'm wanting to implement this thing as a static class, I'm going to have an instance of it in here. So let's see here, item producer. I'm going to call that one instance. And then all the methods on this class will be private. And then I'll expose some static methods, public static methods, in order to interact with this thing. So I want to make a private constructor in here. And I'll be passing in a broker URL and a queue name. This is going to be used when we set up our queue destination. And then on the ActiveMQ message broker, it'll create a queue with the name that we pass in here. So let's see how all this works. We'll say base URL becomes the broker URL. And then the connection factory we'll say that it's a new ActiveMQ connection factory. So just a note here, the connection factory base class or interface, this comes out of the javax.jms. And then this ActiveMQ comes out of the org.apache.activemq packages. And this is an implementation of that interface. So you could be having multiple implementations that come from different providers. We'll give this one the broker URL. Then there's going to be a couple of try methods coming up. So the first thing we want to instantiate is going to be the connection. So we'll go from top to bottom. And this is going to be connection factory dot create a connection. And as we can see here, this thing throws an error. So I'll just catch an exception. And then I'll say in error is true. And the error message for this whole class will then be the message on that exception. If this all fails, then there's no point in continuing. So we can just return out of here. And then this connection has a method on there for start. So that'll start up the ActiveMQ connection. Next up is going to be the session. So we'll say session equals connection.create session. And I don't want this to be transacted at the moment. And the acknowledgement, there I'll put it on session.autoAcknowledge. All right. This thing can throw an exception as well. So we'll say catch exception EX, in error is true. Error message is going to be the message on that exception, and then we can just return out of here. The next thing we want to instantiate is going to be the queue. So queue equals session.createQueue, and then we pass in the queue name. This one can also throw an exception, so I'll catch it. The reason why I'm doing it one at a time is so I can be sure where it failed. So instead of one big try block, I'm having multiple so that I can pinpoint exactly where something will go wrong. Next up is the producer. So we'll say session.createProducer. And this one expects a destination where we pass the queue. And then finally, same deal with the error information. If all this went well, then this thing is not in an error and we can start to produce items. So let's see here. We'll need to create a class for this item entity. So I'm going to create a models package. And then in here, I'll just make a new Java class, call it item. And this thing is going to have a static field. And I'll call it next ID, initialize that to 0. And then I'll have a couple of public fields that will be what this item is all about. So I'll have an ID here, int ID. And I'll have a public string title. Then a constructor that takes in a string for the title. ID becomes the next ID that's available. And then finally, the title becomes the title that we pass in. So now that we have a class that we can put on the queue, let's write a method to actually do that. So I'm going to implement this as a static class, so this can be private. I'll need a try block to put this message on because the code in here could throw an exception. But then we'll start off with creating a message. And the message is created with the session object that we have. And the method we're interested in is this create object message. So in here it expects the ID. So we'll just pass in item.id. And then this thing can throw an exception. So we'll simply catch that exception. If it succeeds in creating an object message, then we can start to set this thing's properties. So we have a set int property, and this is going to be item ID. And we can simply pass in that ID. The reason we're passing it in here as a field is because this thing needs to be recreated somewhere else. And then we can simply read out the properties as they come in. So the next thing is going to be a string property. And it's going to be the title of the item. So item.title. And then we tell the producer to send this message. And this producer was set up to have the queue as its destination. So this will put this message with that item on in the queue. Okay, so now to clean up this class when we're finished with it, we should close all of these resources that we allocated. So starting at the bottom, we can close the producer. Then we close the session. Session was created from a connection, so we can close the connection. And that's it. Each of these can throw an error, but I'm not too concerned if that happens, so I'll catch it, but then I'll ignore that error, and it should work. Okay, so now to create the public interface to this class, I'll have a public static boolean to see if there's any errors. The item producer up here should be static so that we can use it in some static methods. And because this class is accessing its own sort of members, we can access those private fields. Then the next static getter that I want should return that error message. So then we'll just say instance.error. I'll have a public static void initialize method where I pass in a base URL and a queue name. So then we can say instance equals new item producer, and we say that the broker URL is going to be the base URL that was passed in and the queue name. Okay, then I'll want some kind of way to stop this thing or clean it up. So I'll just have something that says terminate, and this is going to call instance.close to clean up all those resources. And then finally a public static void method to add an item to the queue. And this is simply going to call the instance.publish. Okay, let's take this thing for a test drive. I'm going to have an item here. Item I equals new item, some item. And then I'll have a I want to tell my producer, item producer, to initialize. It needs a base URL. on a very specific URL. So it's going to be TCP as the protocol. The IP address is going to be localhost, and then the port is going to be this one. Then the queue name is going to be items. So I'll just make it items. And then we'll say item producer. We'll first check if the item producer is in error. And we can print that. Else, add this item to the queue. And then finally, item producer dot terminate. So I ran it, nothing seemed to fail, but I'd like some feedback on it. I'm gonna print out item added to queue, but do another check to see if this thing successfully added it to the queue. So I'm gonna run it again. Item added to queue. Okay, so now there's 2 items on the queue. And if we build our consumer, then it should start up by consuming 2 items. So that's going to be in the next video.